Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with John Bishop and Ken Perszyk about the euteleological understanding of theism, which is an alternative to personal theism.
Thanks for listening. Well, I'm happy to introduce two guests to the podcast today, John Bishop and Ken Perszyk. John is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the University of Auckland, and Ken is a Professor of Philosophy at the University of Waikato. Both John and Ken have published several things on topics that will be familiar to our listeners, issues in the philosophy of action and agency, Molinism in particular, so we'll encourage listeners to go and check out those things. But the two of them have just co-authored a book as well, and it's called God, Purpose, and Reality, a euteleological understanding of theism. And it was published last year in 2023 by Oxford University Press. And we've invited them to join us today to talk about that work on the show. So welcome to both of you, John and Ken. Could you start by telling us a bit about yourselves, your work, and how you both came to be interested in working on issues related to agency and free will?
Okay, well, I'll begin. So thank you for introducing us, Taylor. When I was doing my PhD, it was on Donald Davidson's view that you had to be a language user in order to be an intentional agent.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually thought that was wrong, and there were some gaps in his argument. So I wrote my PhD, and that was published in a journal article. And I was thinking of writing a book about that. But I thought... I really got involved in the theory of what an intentional action was and Davidson's causal theory of action. And I was interested in the idea that Davidson certainly says pretty explicitly, but he doesn't develop it in great detail, that the causal theory of action is what you need as a compatibilist to explain how agency fits into the natural causal order. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so I published a book in 1989, Cambridge University Press, Natural Agency, about that. And particularly thinking that what you had to do is to explain how episodes of agent causation could be reduced, at least ontologically, to causal change of the right kind, mental causal causing this familiar thing, and the fact that it comes up against the problems of causal deviance. And so I was looking at whether the various ways of dealing with that worked to put a stop to the kind of libertarian agent causationist view of things that I was solidly against.
Mm-hmm.
So just, very briefly, that was what that book was about.
Yeah.
That's great. Thanks, John.
Right. Well, my early work didn't really have much to do with free will. It was on the history of early analytic philosophy, especially Meinong and the early Wittgenstein, and metaphysics and modality. And that was natural because at that time I was at Victoria University, Wellington, for where I was there for many years, which, of course, was the home of Hughes and Creswell. And David Lewis used to visit very regularly on his way to or from Melbourne. So it was not surprising I got into metaphysics and modality. But I've had a long-standing interest in issues about free will. And my earliest work in philosophy of religion was especially about Molinism and really in the context of the problem of evil. And so one of the questions, of course, was, does Molinism make the problem of evil worse?
Mm-hmm.
And on the face of it, it sure looks like it, because if God knew Hitler's counterfactuals of freedom and what he would do if he created them and left them free and then put them in the very situations in which he knew that the Holocaust would occur, it looks rather difficult to think of such a being as a perfectly good moral agent. Now, back then, I sort of tried to deflect that objection, that the open theist, risk-taking God was really no better off. But then I was also looking at the role of Molinism in the free will defense, that, planting a claim that when he developed his defense, that he was making a mere concession to Mackey and his gang, they needed Molinism, but he didn't. Well, I tried to argue that he does need it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've got into issues about, the Molinism wars. I edited their book in 2012 from Oxford University Press, the collection on Molinism. And in that, one of the big issues is Molinism coherent? And that has to do with the assumption is that Molinists have to be libertarians. And then the question is, could there even be these counterfactuals of freedom, what creatures would do if libertarianism is the case?
Mm-hmm.
And then probably one of my last substantive papers on Molinism was on the issue whether a Molinist can really run the consequence argument.
Right. And
I argued that they can't. And so that paper, that was probably some of my later stuff, and that was 2003. But I have done something on sort of a soteriological problem of evil with Molinism, open theism, but I'm not really interested so much anymore in Molinism.
Yeah.
But in our euteleology.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
And perhaps, would it be useful for us to explain, how it was that we came to be working together, or were you going to ask us that next?
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yes.
Something about that.
Well, yes. It's on the context of the free will defense. John had published a paper in 1993, I think it was, in the Australasian Journal of Philosophy, called Compatibilism and the Free Will Defense, in which he tried to show that a compatibilist could run a version of the free will defense. Mm-hmm. And I kind of teed off on that in a paper in the AJP reply in, I think, 99. Mm-hmm. And then, ironically, about a year later, I published a paper in which I argue that a Molinist could be a compatibilist and run a version of the free will defense. So in a sense, then John was right, but not for the reasons he gave. And so it turned out in around 2007 or so, or 8, Joe Kime Campbell asked us to revisit this debate we had over compatibilist versions of the free will defense. Mm-hmm. And so we got together and we thought, we don't really want to work on that. We actually, because we both realized that we both thought that the logical argument from evil was very much alive, contrary to the received view.
Yes, everybody thinks that.
Everyone thinks
planting has put paid to it, and all the focus now is on the evidential form of the argument from evil.
And so we started by pressing a version of the logical argument from evil, and that actually leads really directly into our work on what we call euteleology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very cool. Mm. Well, speaking of euteleology, that's our topic today. So could you say a bit about the view that you all develop in the book and how it differs from a prevalent understanding of God found in the Abrahamic traditions?
Maybe I'll start with just saying that I think it's important to see that there's a distinction between the euteleological metaphysics and how it gets deployed. Now, we happen to deploy it for a particular purpose, namely in the book to give an understanding of Abrahamic theism.
Mm-hmm. That's an alternative.
But it's an alternative to something else, and the question is alternative to what?
Yeah.
But, you could use it, we think, the metaphysics could be developed to maybe produce an interesting version of atheism, or what we're more interested in recently, very recently, is whether you could use it to develop a robust religious naturalism that may or may not be directly wedded to the Abrahamic tradition. But in the book, we give a specific interpretation of, we say, of Abrahamic theism. Now, because what's important about that is in the literature, the recent literature, you're going to often see, depends especially where you hang out and who you read, but you're going to see this term or phrase, alternative conceptions of God. And it's important to realize that most of those are intended to be alternatives to theism. And in particular alternatives to the Abrahamic conception of God. But our euteleological conception is not intended to be one of those. It's intended to be an interpretation of Abrahamic theism.
Mm-hmm.
And then you say, well, what is an alternative to? Within the Abrahamic tradition, well, it's an alternative to what we take as the standard conception amongst analytic philosophers of religion, what we call this personal omnigod conception. The idea that God is a supreme, supernatural person or personal being without a body, who's omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, who creates and sustains all else that exists. And maybe a few other embellishments added, but that's the basic heart of the conception. And so our view is intended to be an alternative to that.
Yeah.
Now, maybe you want to say something more about the actual metaphysical.
So what is the view?
What is the view?
But that's right. So our euteleological conception is supposed to be an alternative conception of the world view of Abrahamic theism itself, namely alternative to the idea that you're thinking that it's all about a supreme personal being who has these omni properties, or at least some slight modification of that, right? And so, well, maybe it's probably best for me to say what the alternative is first of all. We're really going with the idea that perhaps the central notion of existence constituting a creation, right, which is certainly core for the Abrahamic traditions, is really all about existence being meaningful and purposive. You know, it's there for a reason. There is some ultimate point in everything. Things matter. There's an ultimate purpose or telos, you know, for which everything exists. Nothing exists except, in fact, perhaps the very idea of being existence, the very idea of being real generally, is not just sheerly existing, not just to be sheerly, but always to be for the sake of realizing concretely a certain ultimate end, right? Which, if you like to think in Aristotelian terms, you know how in Aristotelian terms things are thought of as having a sort of function or purpose, and then that end for which they exist is the good that they seek to fulfill, and then they're finalized when they achieve that good. Well, the idea is, think of theism as saying reality is like that. Existence is there because it is there to realize an overall good. So the basic sort of premise of euteleology is that reality is inherently directed upon an ultimate end, or telos, which is its good. And since it's the good for reality as such and as a whole, it is the supreme good, right? But, of course, what we're wanting to claim is that this is inherent in what it is to be real. And there's no need for there to be a supernatural personal being whose end it is. It's just sort of built into what reality is, what the essence of reality, the essence of the real, if you like. So that is the basic point. But there's also the point about there being an ultimate explanation.
No, I guess I was going to just stress that this is a non-personal conception of God. That is quite the standardly assumed, widely assumed, that it's essential to theism, and especially to the Abrahamic tradition, that God is literally a person or personal being. That we deny. This is a full-fledged non-personal conception of God, though there's going to be sort of personal elements in the story. and
Sure.
so on and so forth.
Because it might turn out that when you give an account of what that supreme good is, the existence of persons may be necessary for a vital aspect of realizing that supreme good.
And we're not going to deny the usefulness and the importance of personal language. It's the question of what the metaphysics requires. That's what we don't think requires a literally a person or personal being.
Right.
And so is that the reason why you say this is like an alternative within the Abrahamic traditions, because you're going to keep the personal language? Or is there another reason why you want to stay within that?
That would be part of a reason. So, of course, it might be that somebody would like that initial axiom of an inherent cosmic purpose and not want to associate with the Abrahamic traditions or any talk about God at all. So, you know, we're not excluding that, but we, in the book, we definitely want to argue, you know, and maybe quite provocatively, that this could be an adequate metaphysics for understanding the Abrahamic theistic worldviews. Yes. And
of course, there's going to be a host of objections
Yeah.
to that.
But, so is the non-personal part of it an essential part of it?
Sorry,
Is it being non-personal, is that essential?
Yes. It is.
Yes.
It is absolutely essential. And another thing that is essential to it is that it's sort of anti-supernaturalist. There is only the natural world. Although there may be rather more to the natural world. Well, you know, than natural science could possibly disclose. So, you know, in the book that we're writing at the moment, we would describe that as a one-worldist but not metaphysical scientific naturalism. You know, the fact that we still use the personal language is certainly. I mean, it would be very, very odd to say you're giving an interpretation of theism, but theism needs to be understood in such a way that makes just a terrible mistake to have been using personal language about God all along.
Right.
No. It clearly is absolutely essential to theism that as human beings, as persons ourselves, we need to use our capacity for relating to others personally to relate to the ultimate reality that is God. We probably can't think otherwise of God. If we're thinking of the creation, it'll be absolutely natural and inevitable probably for us to think of a creator in personal terms. And so we're not, you know, people assume that we might be trying to reform you know, liturgies and scriptures. And certainly when our book was going to readers, and it went to four different readers because there were, you know, an initial iteration, and we did it again, and it went to other readers after that. One reader was saying, "Oh well, you know, what are you saying? You're saying God is no person," and we even go so far as to say God is not even a thing
of any kind.
Of any kind, God transcends all kind of pinning down into any particular thing amongst other things, which is actually quite a common classical theme. If you look at classical theism. And so he was saying, well, what are you going to say? Are you going to say that no thing so loved the world, that no thing gave his only son? And of course, it's nonsense. That would be nonsense. We're not saying that. We need to use that language, but we need to recognize, as indeed is as a well-established medieval tradition, that in doing that, we're deploying personal language analogously. And in our book, one of the features of our book, which perhaps is well, do you ever do anything completely original in philosophy? You probably don't. But it might be one of the most relatively novel things that we've got in our book, which is to say that the very idea of speaking of God as, a subject of predication, as a thing, and indeed a personal thing, about which we can make attributions and so on, that very move, since God isn't ultimately metaphysically a thing at all, that move is itself an analogy, in which an analogy based on our kind of, Kantian way of organizing the phenomenal world and thinking about it in material objects in space and time and other bodies and other persons and so on. It's a kind of analogous projection of that onto ultimate reality. And this is the only way, if we're going to speak about it at all, and it's good that we should speak about it because, of course, we have to, theism says we need to orient our lives towards that view of the world and let that affect the way we live our lives and our practice. So it's very important that we should be able to do that. But we mustn't run away with the idea that because that language has to be used and it conveys truths about how things are, that it therefore conveys an understanding of the basic metaphysics, that we can somehow look at that language and say, oh, right, now we comprehend that that God is a personal being, and philosophers can then work out he obviously must be a much greater personal being than us, and he wouldn't be restricted by a body. And so philosophers can go into this big theoretical project of working out something like the personal omnigod theory.
Right.
We're saying, no, that's going off in the wrong direction. There's trying to get at the essence of God is, something we probably shouldn't be doing. But we do need to sort of make it intelligible how a worldview like this could be true metaphysically. And we think that the euteleological way of doing it is superior to the personalist way of doing it.
Do you want to say anything about ultimate explanation?
Yeah, okay. So
you're on a roll, Bishop. You might as well.
Yes. That's right. Yes. Oh, well. So of course, one thing about theism is it gives an ultimate explanation for the existence of everything. There is an answer to the question: why is there anything at all rather than nothing? Right. And somebody might think, well, how else could you do that except by positing that there really is a creator who exists necessarily and who then produces the creation, and so you get a sort of supernaturalist naturalist dualism at the fundamental level of your ontology. So what are we going to say if our position doesn't have that dualism, and if it says there's only one world? Are we somehow saying that the world causes itself? And what we actually say is, well, existence is there for a purpose, and it actually achieves its purpose. It's not. I mean, in principle, something could have a purpose and never really achieve it, but we would want to claim that it's there for the realization of the supreme good. The supreme good is realized, we want to say, multiple times within it, right? And then we want to say, and the ultimate reason why it's there is because it does what it's for. It's because it contains within it realizations of the supreme good, which is what it's for, that it's there at all. And that, now, if you interpreted that in terms of ordinary mundane causation, it would be, illegitimately circular or bootstrapping.
Right.
But then we defend ourselves by saying, look, any ultimate form of explanation is going to be appealing to some transcendent higher order of causation that once again we can't comprehend, but we could only understand by an analogous extension from our ordinary ways of understanding things. And we would say, for example, in the personal omnigod theory, if you accept creation ex nihilo, or even if you think that the creator creates out of an initial chaos, um, it's it's an analogous extension from anything we understand about what it is to be an agent creating something in our human context. Right. So similarly, we're saying, well, there are cases where you can explain why things exist because they do what they're for, like tools and artifacts, or indeed, without having to appeal to any intelligent design, if you accept a Darwinian explanation of why animals have hearts, it's because of selection under pressure from the selective pressures, the evolutionary history of this thing explains why it's there. If hearts didn't succeed in pumping blood, they wouldn't be there in the first place. Now, that's not the full explanation. It's only a partial explanation. But once again, it gives you something that's familiar in mundane explanation that you can then extrapolate. So again, this is a fairly bold feature, but it thinks it's something to go on, and it meets the requirement that surely an account of theistic metaphysics would give an ultimate explanation.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, now that we've asked you a bit about what the euteleological view is, and you've contrasted it some with the personal omnigod alternative, you've kind of already said some things to answer this question, but what are some of the reasons that you accept the euteleological view and prefer it over the traditional, at least I think of it as the traditional conception of God, the personal omnigod conception?
Right. I mean, some of the reasons are maybe more, shall we say, negative. I mean, it's the dissatisfaction with the personal omnigod conception. So, I mean, there are, for example, the host of familiar philosophical problems with that conception, with the individual attributes or the package deal, with whether some of the attributes are consistent with others in the package. There's, of course, the famous foreknowledge free will debate. Is God's foreknowledge or middle knowledge compatible with human freedom? And so there's those range of philosophical issues. And of course, the personal omnigod theorist doesn't seem to be that troubled by those. We find difficulty with the notion of an infinite person. I don't happen to think it's coherent. But again, that's more of a philosophical objection that maybe, I found that personal omnigod theorists don't feel that troubled by. But then if we turn to more, shall we say, religious type motivations, that I think the very notion of that I don't think the personal omnigod conception can handle transcendence and immanence. I mean, there's obviously been there's a long-standing tension in Abrahamic theism, at least in the philosophical unpackings of Abrahamic theism, about how to maintain that God's both transcendent but immanent. And we try to tell a story whereby the personal omnigod view just doesn't give the right conception. God's isn't immanent enough.
It's both immanent. I mean, the sort of classical thing is God is so transcendent that if he were the personal omnigod, well, he would be, far greater, in a completely different league from any other person, you'd have to admit. But he would still be a person amongst persons, and that isn't transcendent enough. But then the other side of it is the immanence. I think in Islam they say that God is closer to you than your own jugular vein. Sorry, and then I'm skipping ahead in my mind. Christian mystics talk about God is closer than our own breathing, and you get. God is the one in whom we live and move and have our being. There's a sort of intimacy about God's immanence in everything and in us, that you can't really get, if God always has to be, however intimately related to you, at the distance that is required for God to be a person and you to be a person. So we think these are sort of religious considerations. But then
the main one
is the problem.
Is the problem of evil, and we think there's a version of the logical argument from evil that works, and I don't know if you want us to say a bit more about how we think that goes, but I mean, you might say that planning as free will defense succeeds on its own terms, in the sense that there's a logical point he was trying to make, that Mackey said there couldn't be any evil, at least initially, any evil if there were such a God. And Planning's view is possibly God couldn't have gotten one of these goody-goody worlds. So whereas Mackey has to argue that necessarily God could have, Planning's view is possibly God couldn't have. So defense is enough in that sense against, that was the standard against the logical argument from evil. Now Mackey was never satisfied with that, because Planning's defense, as formulated, required these counterfactuals of freedom, the Molinist assumption in it, that an omnipotent being could be constrained by contingent truths prior to the creation of the universe. And Mackey just found that incoherent. How could omnipotence be bound by contingent truths about creatures what they would do?
Yeah.
And so in that sense, a lot of times that gets glossed over. Planting proved once and for all the consistency of the beliefs. Not really so. But even if you kind of give Planning the logical point, there's a whole another dimension about whether a being who followed the sort of the Plantingian free will defense, whether such a being would be morally perfect or worthy of worship. It comes down to the issue of what the goodness of that being would amount to. And so, every argument from evil is sort of relative to certain assumptions, moral assumptions about what goodness involves. And so Marilyn Adams, for example, was very unhappy with Planning's defense, and, talked about, the kind of goodness wasn't just, maximizing a global good. God had to be good to those who suffer, and so on. And so we took up Marilyn's theme, but then argued that she didn't ultimately succeed either in her scenarios, so that we produce a version of the argument from evil whereby it's logically inconsistent. If you make certain normative assumptions about what perfect moral goodness requires, there's a good argument for the logical impossibility of the omnigod's existence.
Yeah. So perhaps if I just interpolate there. So Marilyn is saying, that God, it's not enough for it to turn out that the value of freedom is such as to to outweigh all the horrific, all the horrors that result from the abuse of free will. God has to ensure that God is good to all the sufferers, and in fact, all the people caught up in horrors, including the perpetrators, she says. And she thinks that God, we shouldn't concentrate just on what God's reasons were, which obviously were good reasons for allowing evil in the first place. We have to remember that God has these amazing resources to cope with the results of the evil that comes from his allowing freedom.
Right.
And so she says God needs to be and will be able to be good to everybody involved in the horrors. But this, of course, does require that a lot of very important things take place in the afterlife, including the reconciliation amongst the perpetrators of horrors and the sufferers of horrors. But she thinks that this can be done, and of course she's committed to universalism, that God's love is such that even the worst horrific evils and the worst perpetrators can be reconciled, and so on. Now, what we say about this is that this raises questions about what sort of an overall personal relationship a personal God would have if, for very good reasons, he first allows horrors and allows these people to experience them, and then
wonderfully
wonderfully redeems them in the joy of everlasting personal relationship with him. We think that you could think that there's something sort of overly manipulative, something just not quite right, let alone perfect, about the kind of personal relationship that would be. And we don't claim to prove that moral judgment is correct, but we just claim to show that it's plausible, and that somebody who was a theist might find it plausible. And then theists who do find it plausible will have a reason for thinking that even if they can accept Marilyn Adams' views about the afterlife, right, it'll still be the case that this isn't consistent with God's perfection. And it really comes to the conclusion that, if there were a personal omni-God in the first place, he would be able to work all this out. I say he, of course, without any justification. He'd be able to work all this out, and he would see reluctantly that it just isn't going to be possible, unfortunately, to create our kind of world. And then I take that as a kind of reductio of absurdum, that something has gone wrong. We're taking far too metaphysically seriously language which we ought to see as deeply analogous, but nevertheless important and capable of conveying truth, the personal language about God.
And then the important point of the logical argument from evil, if you think there's a successful version, we got to remind ourselves what the conclusion is of the argument. It's that there is or can be no personal omni-God. And that leaves open the question of whether there's a better conception of God. And that's where, we think and then we slip in. I mean, because if the personal omni-God conception, if you think there are good reasons to get rid of it, well, then what? If you want to have a conception of God, and if you want to defend Abrahamic theism, what do you do? And so that's the motivation then to explore this alternative conception within, the Abrahamic tradition, if that's what you want to do.
Well, let's move on to some of the practical implications of euteleological metaphysics, especially for religious belief and practice. So, for instance, does belief in an afterlife make sense according to this view on this picture? Or is there any room for practices like prayer and worship?
Well, look, first, let me just say regarding the afterlife, that there's no afterlife for us on our account if you understand that to involve the continued existence of ourselves forever as finite beings, especially in some other realm or something. But so our personal survival in much the same form, but just like living forever, is out.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, there is no afterlife. We have recently explored whether there could be something along the lines of reincarnation, but we never, we just sort of haven't really gone there.
Well, because that tends not to come up in the theist
and not in
context.
in the traditional context, so we don't explore it there.
But then we would be inclined to say, if you look at the theistic tradition,
you don't have to view
that's right,
an afterlife in that way.
You'd better not be too precise about what the hope for life beyond death means, or the hope for the overcoming of the fear of death, of the the sense that somehow death renders everything meaningless. I think it is possible to defend as quite a sort of scriptural view in Judeo-Christianity that human beings are essentially mortal beings. We come to birth, we die. We have a mortal span. Remember, O man, you are dust, and unto dust you will return. Right? But this is what the priest says when you're marked with ashes on your forehead on Ash Wednesday, if you have that tradition. But then it goes on, repent and believe the good news, which the good news is the good news of the resurrection, which you can interpret as saying, but the mortal, the fact that it dies, it doesn't destroy that life. Indeed, the death of that life is a passing of that life into immortality. But then we would say, well, immortality is dwelling with God, and if we think in terms of God non-personally, then God is not a thing in time or anything. So spending eternity with God is not a sort of continuation of our current existence, and sort of saying, oh, you don't have to worry, death isn't really real, it's just passing, and you're going to have more of the same forever and ever and ever, which, no. I'm rather keen on Bernard Williams on this, on reflections on the tedium of immortality. He was my supervisor in Cambridge when I was doing my PhD. So I think that there are ways of defending what eternal life is that don't require that conception of immortality, and that we're not going. The fact that our metaphysics takes us in that direction doesn't take us too far on a limb, because this is an area of great controversy about how it should be understood within the traditions anyway.
And we haven't really discussed this aspect in the book much, but we have a paper that was in the Simon Kittle Georg Gasser volume, 2022 Routledge, called, I think, The Divine Nature, Personal Perspectives or something, where we have a paper on the what sense we could make of the Christian hope for eternal life. So that there's a further discussion in there, but not in the book.
Yes.
Oh, and then you asked us about prayer and worship. Right.
Yeah. So,
I mean, look, yes. I mean, one of the major complaints, of course, is that against us is this sort of practical objection that how could it be religiously adequate, your conception? How could you begin to make sense of the Christian practice of prayer, especially petitionary and worship? I mean, don't these practices require that God be understood as a person? And we don't think so. We don't think so. That worship needn't be understood as bowing down to some supreme person. In fact, there's objections to that understanding. Prayer, especially petitionary, needn't be understood as making requests for favors from a being who would know everything about your situation, and if they're perfectly good, would you'd think would be working towards whatever is best in the situation. Actually, the problem of prayer is sort of parallel to the problem of evil, and there are problems with that notion. We don't think that prayer needs to be understood in that way. So there are negative problems negatively about the standard conceptions of prayer and worship. But then we try to argue that there is a positive account we could give of prayer and worship.
That's right. And again, it's going back into the traditions themselves and seeing that many people who reflect on prayer, they say, well, look, prayer isn't real unless it's involving some transformation of the one who is praying.
Right.
That they are developing the capacity to focus on understanding the will of God in their particular circumstance. And that the prayer, the ultimate prayer is "Thy will be done."
Right.
And so really, there isn't. It isn't actually. It's a kind of aligning oneself with the will of God, which, of course, on our account, that God has a will is something analogous. But there is something in the metaphysics, namely the inherent directedness of everything upon the supreme good. And of course, it's going to be important to ask questions about what the supreme good is. And one's going to say, look at these traditions. They are giving us revelations of how to understand the supreme good, as in the giving of the law in Judaism, or in Christianity, to say the ultimate revelation is the love of Christ. So, a Christian euteleologist could say, we know what everything is for in the love that Christ exhibited, and which he commanded us to love one another as he has loved us. And insofar as we do that, whenever we succeed in doing that, we are realizing the purpose for which everything exists. And of course, we don't have to deny that other creatures on Earth or elsewhere in the universe or elsewhere in other universes in a multiverse, if that's what it is, might be doing the same thing in ways that we can't really even imagine. So we don't have to come to the conclusion that it's all about us, but we would certainly want to say we are participating in this realization of the supreme good. And so in doing that, we are already in eternal life, so to speak. This might fit again with understanding that isn't destroyed by our death. That is our participation in something that is eternally there somehow. And then again, once again, with worship, you would say, well, it's well known that somebody who says I worship God, but I don't love my brother, this person is deceiving themselves. Really, the worship that God cares about is the doing of God's will. I'm getting sick of all your jolly blood sacrifices. I'm concerned about whether you're behaving justly in your arrangement for your widows and your orphans, which was a particularly problematic thing in the patriarchal society of the Hebrew culture and so on. So again, certain ways of conceiving of immortality, of prayer and worship are excluded on this view.
Right.
But they can connect with themes that are really there in the tradition, and which some people might judge are really the authentic basis of what these practices are essentially all about.
And the last chapter of the book tries to get into more detail about both worship and prayer,
right?
The objection and the positive account. So there's more details there.
Yeah. Thanks for that. That's really interesting. And I'd recommend people check out the book. We want to make sure this is the free will show. We want to make sure to ask some questions specifically about free will along the way. As I mentioned in the introduction, and y'all both mentioned in introducing your work, y'all have both done extensive work on issues in philosophy of action and free will. Besides maybe the problem of evil, although you could say more about that if it's relevant here, what are some ways that you see this background in agency and free will as related to euteleological metaphysics?
Yes, well, we were wondering how we would answer this earlier, and Ken reminded me that Andrei Bakarev, who people who know about philosophy of agency will know Andrei, I'm sure.
Yeah, we've interviewed him on the show, and actually, I think he shouted out your 1989 book, John, when we interviewed him.
That's right. Yes. He and Jesus Aguila were both quite enthusiastic about it, and some of their work has sort of picked up on that. And he said to me some time ago, hey, the stuff that you're doing on these concepts of God and so on, it's kind of, it has an underlying methodological theme in common with what you did in agency. I'm sort of scratching my head and thinking what it is. But I think it's something like this, that an agency, I was wanting to defend the combination of agent causation being irreducible conceptually, but having to be reducible ontologically, right? And that, of course, entails that our ordinary language, I think, the way to understand the grammar of action, you have to see an action as a relation between an agent or a person and some event or state of affairs that they bring about or they allow to persist or so on. But it doesn't follow that you therefore have to have in your ontology a primitive agent-event relation at all. Maybe in your ontology, all you've got is relations amongst events. And what persons are is something that emerges out of very complicated processes and states and so on. So the theme is the language that we use for it and in which we convey truths about it does not convey understanding of what the underlying ontology is. And I think Andre was pointing out to me that I was wanting to say, Ken and I were wanting to say the same thing about the language about God. That the language about God, sure, and this is something that's sort of distinctive about theism, is that we're invited to think of God in personal ways, right? And that language can convey truths which otherwise we wouldn't perhaps have access to. But it doesn't. You mustn't necessarily assume that that's transparent to the underlying ontology. So I think that is right, that there is that connection between the work I did in agency and this work that Ken and I have been doing together.
That's interesting.
You both have discussed your work with philosophers and with theologians. So what are some of the common reactions, and what do you take to be the most serious objections that people have raised?
Right. Well, I mean, the common reaction, it seems, amongst the analytic personal omnigod theorists is an incredulous stare, or simply to be ignored.
Right.
Theologians, I mean, it's a very funny situation. The theologians, by and large, seem to think the idea of a non-personal God is obvious and find it almost mad that anyone takes the personal God literally as metaphysically true. And so this is a very funny situation, where the philosophers, the analytic philosophers who are wedded to this personal omnigod conception, have a very different view than the theologians, I think, on lots of these things. And theologians, well, we seem to have been more warmly received by especially some Catholic German theologians, especially in Bavaria, but not just in Bavaria. So we seem to have hit a chord with certain German Catholic theologians.
Yes, so we were recently, we spent, 7 weeks in Munich, because we were invited by a professor at the Faculty of Catholic Theology at LMU called Thomas Schertl, to be there. And we had 5 sessions in seminars in which they were doing a postgraduate seminar discussing this book. So that was very nice, but we've had nothing like that kind of reaction in the Anglo-American world. And I think, you were saying to me earlier today that Bill Wainwright at some stage said that he thought the most fundamental thing in philosophy of religion was the difference between
the divide.
People who thought that God was a personal being literally, and people who thought that wasn't the case.
Non-personal conceptions.
And that may be true. But what seems to us to be the case is that for some reason, if that is the most fundamental issue, you would think that lots of people would be engaging in debate about it. But it seems as if they don't. I mean, there are people.
There are some papers, yeah, but not much.
There are some, but it doesn't have as much attention as you would expect. But there certainly are important people on the non-personalist side, like Brian Davis, and
David Burrell Herb McCabe,
yes,
those sort of
that's right.
A different sort of interpretation, I think, as well as of the classical theists.
But I think, it seemed to be very widely thought, classical theism, it's too abstract, God is simple. How could a simple God possibly be something worth worshipping? It doesn't fit with the religious experience. They see that as obviously religiously inadequate. And so if you're putting forward a non-personalist metaphysics, then they're not really interested in talking to you because they've already worked out that isn't really where it's at.
I used to keep a running tab of all the authors that in any work in philosophy of religion that would just drop the comment that, of course, it's essential to theism, the Christian theism, that God is understood as a person. I used to keep running tab. I must have about 100 of these listed for the sources of people who've said this in just passing. It's just assumed. So when you run up against that, just like, we ran up against the difficulty of everyone assuming that planning as free will defense was a knockdown refutation of anyone who thought the argument from evil worked, the logical argument from evil. So we had a hard time initially persuading people to begin to take seriously our norm relativized version of the logical argument from evil. Because you're nuts. Everyone knows. We learned at Planning as Knee that this has been solved. But David Lewis didn't think so. Graham Oppie didn't think so. Richard Gale didn't think so. Quentin Smith didn't think so. And we don't think so. There's only seemingly a handful of us that have ever doubted. Mackey, of course, didn't think that the logical argument was put to sleep. But this is part of the folklore.
Yeah, and another thing that's quite interesting is a lot of people who are not themselves theists, they're convinced atheists. They also think, you're nuts trying to give this non-personal metaphysics for theism, and so somebody said to us, this is a great book. Yeah, I really like it. I'm very sympathetic. But it can't possibly, it won't get any traction unless it's put forward as a kind of interesting atheism, religious atheism, and of course, we are sort of working on saying, well, perhaps it'll serve for religious atheism as well, what you think of as religious atheism. But of course, they think of what they're putting forward as religious atheism because it doesn't have a personal God.
Yes.
So they're already buying into the idea that the only way you could possibly be a theist is by believing quite literally at the level of deep metaphysics that God is a personal being.
Now, you asked us about what we thought were the most serious challenges. And while we think that the logical argument from evil doesn't affect us, we are the first to admit that our view faces a problem of evil as well. I think any view that's worth its salt and that has any chance of being adequate is going to have a problem about evil. If evil's no problem, I think there's a problem. So we do have a problem. There is an evidential version. If euteleology is so, or the idea that there's an overall telos of the supreme good, well, why the hell is there so much crap in the world? How can you account for the reasonableness of believing in an overall telos that's the supreme good if the world is as shitty as it is? And so we face an evidential version of the argument from evil. And we deal with that at length in chapter 5 of the book to try to diffuse it via a privationist account and also helping ourselves to some of the traditional type theodicies along the way.
Yes, but I think it's important to say that we're not trying to do, so to speak, a natural theology for euteleology. We're trying to say we're prepared to say, well, this is a tradition that claims that it reveals the nature of ultimate reality. And we're trying to work out what is the content of the sort of metaphysics that goes with that claim. And so we could certainly say, if you were looking purely empirically at what the world is like, you probably would not come to the conclusion that euteleology is true. But if you find yourself within this tradition that probably would say, well, whatever your metaphysics are, the idea, that the world is fundamentally good, and that that God is a perfectly good God, is sovereign, and that there is a victory over evil and so on. This isn't offered as terribly empirically plausible. It's offered kind of for its practical worth as a faith stance that is going to enable us to live life well, individually and collectively. So actually, we were realizing in writing our book at the moment that we're thinking of metaphysics not as something that's arrived at through, theoretical means on the basis of either a priori or sort of empirical evidence, but much more along the lines of as posits that are about the nature of ultimate reality that seem to be required from a sort of practical, moral, and ethical point of view. That we need if we're going to be able to live life well. These are the ideals we need to believe in, and we need to believe that reality is favorable in the sense that it is reasonable to pursue them, hopefully, despite what seem like the inevitable failures and the obstacles and so on. And we think that typically religions are providing something in that kind of practical space, and that trying to secure their metaphysics simply as a matter of on theoretical grounds is something that, of course, philosophers will think that they should be dedicated to, but might actually be a mistake. So, I mean, that's a rather deep methodological issue.
So when we gave various talks before writing the book, the main objections we always heard in the Q&As were, how do you account for evil? What sense could you make of prayer and worship? What about the afterlife? So those were the ones. And for at least the evil issue of prayer and worship, we discussed that in the book. We've touched a bit on the afterlife in a different paper. Maybe the other issue has to do with whether we're really theological fictionalists in disguise.
Oh,
And we try to address that in the book a bit, but there's an exchange coming out hopefully soon that will continue that discussion.
Yes. So if we can plug,
yes.
I mean, we haven't seen any reviews of our book yet, which I suppose is not surprising because people are going to think it isn't. Is it really worth replying? Because
it's not.
It's not. But again, Andrei Bakrev, he is the reviews editor of the International Journal for Philosophy of Religion, as you probably know, and he has organized a symposium, and we have Eric Yang and Andrew Eshelman and Phil Goff, who have very interesting reviews of our stuff, because obviously our stuff has got quite a lot in common with Phil's views, although there are important differences. And we have written a reply to that, and that should be coming out in IJPR within the next 6 months or so, I hope, or within the next 12 months.
Hopefully.
So there is some discussion there. And as Ken says, one of the other challenges is, especially if we're saying the very idea of God as a thing is an analogous extension. God in metaphysics is no thing. How is that different from the view that says, oh, well, God is just a purely fictional construction? But we very much do not want to endorse an anti-realist fictionalist. We see in a sense, it's a construction, but it's an absolutely necessary construction for enable us to be properly oriented to ultimate reality, if theism is true.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, I was just going to thank you all again for joining us and to ask where listeners could go to follow your work. I will definitely be following that symposium in the International Journal for Philosophy of Religion. Is there anything else that you could point our listeners to?
Well, I guess our current project, which hopefully will be out next year, is due by December 1st, technically, of this year,
Yes.
Is with the Cambridge element on religious naturalism.
Okay.
And we're going to tie some of our views on euteleology in, but not necessarily as wedded to the Abrahamic tradition, though we'll borrow bits maybe from it. But it's a wider discussion of religious naturalism, but will appeal to the notion of an overall purpose as something that's useful for a robust religious naturalism.
That's great.
Yeah, and that's in a series that's edited by Eugene Nakasawa.
Mm-hmm.
It's called Global Philosophy of Religion.
Okay.
Very cool.
Great.
Well, thanks again, John and Ken.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for inviting us.
Thanks.
In our next episode, we'll focus on divine grace and human free will, and our guest will be Kevin Tempe, William H. Jalema Chair of Christian Philosophy at Calvin University.
Say hello to him for me. We hung out together at Notre Dame for a while.
Oh, cool.